The departure gate at Denver International buzzed with the restless energy of a delayed afternoon flight. Rolling suitcases rattled across the tile floor. Overhead monitors flickered between destinations. A storm somewhere east had slowed everything, and patience was wearing thin. Evelyn Carter stood near the boarding line like she owned it. She was mid-40s, sharp blazer, designer carry-on, phone pressed to her ear as if the conversation were more important than everyone else in the terminal. Her heels clicked in irritation every few seconds. She glanced at her watch, then at the growing line, then back toward the narrow aisle leading to the jet bridge. That was when she noticed him. The old man stood just inside the boarding lane, slightly off to the side but not enough for her liking. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just standing there, holding a small, worn leather cap in both hands. His jacket looked decades old, dark blue, frayed at the cuffs. His shoulders were sloped, his hair silver and neatly combed, his posture careful, as if every movement cost him something. To Evelyn, he was an obstacle. She pulled the phone from her ear and let out a sharp sigh, loud enough to be heard over the terminal noise. "Excuse me," she said, not quite shouting but close. The old man turned slowly, his eyes steady and calm. "Yes, ma'am." "You're blocking the line," Evelyn said. "Some of us have connections to make." "I'm sorry," he replied gently, stepping a few inches to the side. It wasn't enough for her. She rolled her eyes and waved a manicured hand toward the gate agent. "Is he supposed to be standing here? Because this is ridiculous." A few nearby passengers glanced over. A young mother shifted uncomfortably. A college kid pulled out his phone, already sensing drama. The gate agent offered a tight smile. "Sir, if you don't mind stepping back just a bit until your boarding group is called." The old man nodded immediately. "Of course." He moved, careful and deliberate, as though afraid of taking up space he didn't deserve. He retreated toward the wall near the windows, where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor. Evelyn scoffed under her breath. "Unbelievable," she muttered, loud enough for several people to hear. "They should really prioritize boarding better." No one responded, no one defended him. The old man simply stood there, eyes drifting toward the runway outside, where planes lifted into the gray-blue sky. He looked peaceful, almost distant, as if the noise of the terminal couldn't quite reach him. Boarding began minutes later. First class was called and Evelyn straightened instantly, reclaiming her place of importance. She marched forward, chin lifted, passing the old man without looking at him again. As she scanned her boarding pass, she spoke to the flight attendant with forced politeness. "I hope the rest of boarding goes faster than that." The attendant nodded, professional smile fixed. "We'll do our best, ma'am." Evelyn stepped onto the jet bridge, satisfied. Behind her, boarding groups continued. When the old man's turn came, he approached quietly, handing over his paper boarding pass. The flight attendant scanned it and paused. Her eyes dropped to the name, then to his face, then back to the screen. "Sir," she said gently, "may I see that again?" "Of course," he replied, offering it back without question. She scanned it a second time. Nothing was wrong. Everything was in order. Still, something about the name made her hesitate. She forced a smile. "Thank you, right this way." As he stepped onto the jet bridge, she glanced instinctively toward the cockpit door, which stood open as the pilots finished their pre-flight checks. Inside, Captain Ryan Mitchell sat in the left seat, reviewing systems, his headset resting loosely around his neck. He had flown this route dozens of times. Routine, predictable, just another day in the air. Then he looked up. For a brief second, his eyes met the old man as he passed the cockpit doorway. The world seemed to stall. The captain's hand froze mid-motion. His breath caught in his chest. The face, older now, lined with time but unmistakable, the posture, the eyes, the quiet gravity. "No," he whispered under his breath. The old man continued down the aisle, unaware, or perhaps pretending not to notice. He walked slowly, one hand brushing the tops of the seats for balance, murmuring polite apologies as passengers shifted to let him pass. First class was nearly full. Evelyn was already seated, buckled in, scrolling on her phone. She barely noticed when the old man paused beside her row, checking the seat numbers. He continued past her. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Of course. All the way to the back. The old man reached the final row, sliding into the window seat. He placed his leather cap carefully on his lap, folded his hands over it, and stared straight ahead. The hum of the aircraft wrapped around him like a familiar sound. Up front, Captain Mitchell slowly stood. "What is it?" his co-pilot asked. Mitchell didn't answer right away. His eyes were still fixed down the aisle. "I need to see the manifest," he said quietly. The co-pilot frowned. "We're almost done here." "I know," Mitchell replied. His voice was steady, but his face was. "Just please." The manifest appeared on the screen. Mitchell scrolled, heart pounding harder with every second. There it was. The name. Same spelling, same middle initial. He swallowed. "That can't be a coincidence," he muttered. Outside the cockpit, the cabin settled. Overhead bins slammed shut. Flight attendants moved through final checks. Evelyn leaned back, closing her eyes, convinced the inconvenience of the gate was behind her. She had no idea that in a matter of minutes, everything about this flight, and her, was about to change. Because the man she had ordered to move was not just another passenger. And the pilot who had just recognized him was no longer thinking about schedules, storms, or altitude. He was thinking about a moment in history that had never left him. And whether the entire plane was ready to hear it, the cabin lights dimmed slightly as the final passengers boarded, and the low mechanical hum of the aircraft settled into a steady rhythm. To most people, it was just background noise. To Evelyn Carter, it was reassurance. Movement meant progress. Progress meant control. She adjusted the collar of her blazer and crossed her legs, angling her body toward the aisle as if first class were a stage and she were meant to be seen. Her phone vibrated again. She glanced at the screen, then sighed and locked it. Unbelievable, she thought. Delays, crowds, and people who didn't know where they belonged. She leaned toward the flight attendant making her way down the aisle. "Excuse me," she said, lowering her voice just enough to sound civilized. "Is boarding always this disorganized?" The attendant smiled politely. "We're almost finished, ma'am." "Well, it didn't feel that way at the gate," Evelyn replied. "Some people really slow things down." The attendant followed her gaze instinctively, down the aisle, toward the back of the plane, toward the old man. He sat motionless, hands folded over his worn cap, eyes forward. He didn't fidget, didn't check his phone, didn't look around. He seemed detached from the urgency and impatience that filled the cabin, as though time moved differently for him. The attendant nodded once, noncommittal. "Let me know if you need anything else." Evelyn watched her walk away, lips tightening. She hated that the moment had passed without validation. People like that, she thought, always got away with being inconvenient simply because no one wanted to say anything. The door closed with a solid thud. Final. The safety demonstration began, and Evelyn half listened, her attention drifting. She glanced toward the cockpit, expecting nothing more than the usual routine. Instead, she noticed movement. The captain was standing. That was unusual. Pilots didn't stand during boarding unless something was wrong. He leaned slightly toward a flight attendant near the cockpit, speaking in a low voice. She nodded, her expression shifting from neutral to concerned. Evelyn's curiosity stirred, but only briefly. It wasn't her problem. The aircraft began to push back from the gate. The engines whined louder, vibrations traveling through the floor and up the seat frame. Outside, Ground crew waved as the plane inched backward, aligning itself for taxi. In the cockpit, Captain Ryan Mitchell stared at the manifest again. He had memorized the name now. It burned behind his eyes. "Captain," his co-pilot said carefully, "you okay?" Mitchell exhaled slowly. "Do you remember the emergency procedures lecture from flight school?" he asked. The co-pilot frowned. "Which one?" "The one they only talked about once," Mitchell said. "The one about the incident they don't like to put in textbooks." The co-pilot's face changed. "You don't mean?" Mitchell nodded once. "That man back there, I think it's him." Silence filled the cockpit. "That's not possible," the co-pilot said finally. "That was decades ago." "I know," Mitchell replied, "but I'd know that face anywhere." The co-pilot hesitated. "What do you want to do?" Mitchell didn't answer immediately. He looked out through the cockpit window at the runway ahead. He had thousands of hours in the air, countless flights completed without incident. But his heart was pounding now like it had during his very first solo flight. "I want confirmation," he said, discreetly. The co-pilot nodded and tapped the intercom. "Cabin crew, cockpit." A senior flight attendant responded almost immediately. When she stepped inside, Mitchell lowered his voice. "I need you to verify a passenger's identity. Last row, window seat, name on the manifest." The attendant's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Is there an issue?" "Not a security one," Mitchell said. "A personal one." She nodded, understanding the unspoken rule of aviation. When a captain asked, you didn't question why. "I'll be back," she said. As she walked down the aisle, Evelyn watched her go. Something about the way the attendant moved, focused, purposeful, made Evelyn uneasy. She leaned back in her seat, arms crossed. Why did it feel like the attention was shifting away from first class? The attendant reached the back of the plane and crouched slightly beside the old man's seat. "Sir," she said gently, "may I speak with you for a moment?" He looked at her, eyes kind, unguarded. "Of course." She spoke quietly, careful not to draw attention. "Captain Mitchell wanted me to ask, did you ever serve as a flight instructor, military or civilian?" The old man's fingers tightened, almost imperceptibly, around the leather cap. "Yes," he said after a pause, "a long time ago." Her breath caught. "And were you ever involved in an incident over the Midwest, severe weather, dual engine failure?" The cabin noise seemed to fade for him. "Yes," he said again, softer this time. The attendant swallowed. "May I have your permission to relay that to the captain?" The old man nodded. "If he's asking, then he already knows." As she stood, he added quietly, "Please tell him there's no need for fuss. I'm just another passenger today." She managed a small smile. "I'll let him know." As she walked back toward the cockpit, Evelyn noticed the exchange. Her eyes narrowed. Why was a flight attendant having a private conversation with that man? What could possibly be so important? The attendant entered the cockpit and closed the door behind her. Mitchell didn't wait. "Well." "She confirmed it," the attendant said. "He is who you think he is." Mitchell closed his eyes for a brief second, steadying himself. When he opened them, they shone with something dangerously close to emotion. "Thank you," he said. "You can return to your duties." The attendant hesitated. "Captain, what's going on?" Mitchell met her gaze. "History," he said simply. The engines roared as the aircraft began its taxi toward the runway. Outside, the sky darkened with approaching weather, clouds rolling like distant waves. In first class, Evelyn felt the plane turn and frowned. "We're stopping," she said aloud. A man across the aisle shrugged. "Probably traffic." But the plane slowed more than usual. Then it stopped completely. The seatbelt sign remained on. Moments later, the captain's voice came over the intercom. It wasn't the calm, rehearsed tone passengers were used to. It was controlled but heavy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mitchell began, "please remain seated. We are pausing our departure for a brief, unexpected reason." Evelyn's stomach tightened. She looked down the aisle again, toward the back of the plane, toward the old man who sat quietly, unaware that an entire aircraft had just stopped moving because of him. The aircraft sat motionless on the taxiway, engines idling with a low, patient growl. Outside the windows, another plane rolled past, lifting into the sky as if nothing unusual were happening. Inside, however, a quiet tension spread seat by seat, whispered questions rising and falling like static. Evelyn Carter sat up straighter. A pause on the taxiway was never good news. She glanced at her watch again, irritation tightening her jaw. If this delay made her miss her connection, someone would hear about it. Around her, passengers shifted in their seats. A man loosened his tie. A woman whispered to her husband. Phones came out, screens lighting up with half-written messages about unexplained delays. At the very back of the cabin, the old man remained still. He knew the sound of idling engines. He knew the feel of a plane that should be moving but wasn't. He had felt it in worse moments than this, moments when silence in the cockpit meant lives balanced on a breath. Still, he didn't react. He rested his hands on his cap and stared at the seat in front of him, his expression unreadable. In the cockpit, Captain Ryan Mitchell stood with his palms braced against the console, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The name echoed in his mind like a warning bell. "Captain," his co-pilot said carefully, "operations is asking why we're stopped." Mitchell exhaled through his nose. "Tell them we're resolving a cockpit matter." The co-pilot hesitated. "Ryan, this is a commercial flight. We can't just—" "I know," Mitchell said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Give me a minute." He reached into the side pocket beside his seat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, old, yellowed at the edges. He had kept it there for years, tucked behind checklists and manuals, a relic from flight school. He unfolded it slowly. The heading read, "Case Study, Incident 417. Below it was a name. The same name on the manifest. Mitchell swallowed hard. He remembered the lecture vividly. The instructor's voice had dropped, the classroom unusually silent. "This isn't in the textbooks," the man had said, "because it didn't end in a crash, but it could have. A storm system over the Midwest, instruments failing, both engines compromised. A training flight turned catastrophe. Everyone expected fatalities. Except there weren't any. Because one man refused to panic." Mitchell had been a young cadet then, sitting in the back row, barely believing the story as it unfolded. The instructor had paused at the end, eyes scanning the room. "If you ever meet this man," he'd said, "you stand up." Mitchell folded the paper again, hands trembling just slightly. "That's him," he said quietly. The co-pilot stared. "You're sure?" Mitchell nodded. "I'd bet my wings on it." The co-pilot leaned back, processing. "So what do we do?" Mitchell looked toward the closed cockpit door, beyond which sat nearly 200 passengers who had no idea they were sharing a cabin with someone who had changed aviation history, quietly, without recognition. "What we should have done a long time ago," Mitchell said. Out in the cabin, Evelyn felt the tension sharpening. The captain's announcement hadn't explained anything. People hated uncertainty more than delay. She leaned into the aisle and caught the eye of a flight attendant. "Excuse me," she said, forcing a polite smile. "Do we know how long this is going to take?" The attendant's expression was calm, but her eyes held something else, anticipation maybe. "It won't be long, ma'am." "That's what they always say," Evelyn muttered. She followed the attendant's gaze again, and once more it led toward the back of the plane. Her annoyance flared. What was so special about that man? In row 36, the old man felt eyes on him. He had felt it before, in waiting rooms, at ceremonies he didn't attend, in moments when the past threatened to surface. He shifted slightly, the leather cap creasing under his fingers. He didn't want attention. He had lived long enough to know that recognition often came too late, and when it came, it carried weight he wasn't sure he wanted to lift again. The intercom chimed softly in the cockpit. "Captain," the senior flight attendant said, "the cabin is getting restless." Mitchell nodded. "I know." He straightened his uniform, smoothing the sleeves with deliberate care. Every motion felt heavier now, as if he were preparing not for an announcement, but for a moment that mattered. "Keep everyone seated," he said. "I'll handle the rest." He took one last look at the instruments, then at the name on the folded paper in his hand. And then he opened the cockpit door. The sound carried down the aisle, a subtle click that somehow quieted the cabin. Conversations faded, heads turned. Evelyn froze mid-sentence. Pilots didn't leave the cockpit on the taxiway. Captain Mitchell stepped out, his presence commanding without effort. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply looked down the length of the aircraft. From first class to economy, passengers followed his gaze as it traveled. Past Evelyn, past the bulkhead, row by row, all the way to the back. To the old man. The old man looked up. Their eyes met again. Recognition passed between them like a current. Mitchell felt his throat tighten. For a heartbeat, he was no longer a seasoned captain. He was a student pilot again, sitting in awe, listening to a story that taught him what calm under pressure truly meant. The old man gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, a silent request. "Please don't." Mitchell hesitated. Behind him, the entire plane watched. Evelyn felt a sudden chill. Something about the stillness, the way the captain stood there, unsettled her. This wasn't a routine issue. This wasn't mechanical. This was personal. Mitchell took a slow breath. Then he turned back toward the cockpit. Without a word, he stepped inside and closed the door. The murmurs exploded instantly. What was that about? Did you see who he was looking at? Is something wrong with the plane? Evelyn's pulse quickened. She stared down the aisle, her earlier confidence slipping. For the first time since she'd entered the airport, she felt out of control. At the back, the old man closed his eyes briefly. He had hoped the past would stay buried. In the cockpit, Captain Mitchell picked up the intercom microphone again. His hand was steady now, his decision made. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice filling the cabin, "thank you for your patience." The cabin fell silent. "There is something I need to do before we take off," Mitchell continued, "and it cannot wait until we land." Evelyn's breath caught. Around her, passengers leaned forward, hanging on every word. The old man opened his eyes. Whatever was coming, he knew one thing for certain. This flight was no longer just a journey through the sky. It was about to become a reckoning, one that would change how everyone on board saw him. And how one woman in first class would see herself. The plane had barely cleared the gate when the unexpected happened. The aircraft slowed to a near halt on the taxiway. Outside, ground vehicles waited unaware, while another jet lifted gracefully into the storm-darkened sky. Inside, the passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some murmuring questions, others pulling out phones to check for updates. Evelyn Carter's irritation spiked. She had managed chaos before, navigated airport delays, and endured cranky crowds, but nothing prepared her for a pilot halting a plane mid-taxi without explanation. Her nails dug into the armrest. She glanced down the aisle, scanning the rows, seeking someone to answer the silence that pressed in like a physical weight. Meanwhile, at the back, the old man sat still, hands folded over his leather cap. His face remained calm, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of recognition, the kind that comes when someone realizes history is about to repeat itself. He had been part of moments that changed lives, moments that demanded precision, patience, and courage. And somehow, the hum of idling engines reminded him of every one of them. In the cockpit, Captain Ryan Mitchell's gaze darted between the flight instruments and the old man's row visible through the cockpit window. His co-pilot, uneasy, tried to maintain composure. "Captain, we can't just stop here indefinitely," he said, voice low, almost pleading. "Operations is asking for a reason, and the passengers." Mitchell held up a hand. "I know what I'm doing, trust me." His voice was steady, but the set of his jaw, the hard line at his temple, betrayed the emotional storm beneath. 9 minutes, he muttered under his breath, almost as if marking a timer. "That's all it will take." Back in first class, Evelyn leaned forward. 9 minutes, she murmured to herself, confusion and irritation mingling. 9 minutes of what? Traffic. Mechanical checks. She looked down the aisle again. A ripple of curiosity had passed among the passengers, everyone instinctively sensing that something significant was unfolding. At the rear of the plane, a flight attendant leaned close to the old man, voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, the captain wants to acknowledge you. Please, just for a moment." The old man shook his head slightly, his expression gentle but resolute. "I do not seek attention," he said softly. His voice carried the weight of decades, a quiet authority that made even the young flight attendant pause. "This is not about me. It is never about me." The flight attendant hesitated, then nodded and returned to the cockpit. The tension in the cabin was palpable now, like static electricity clinging to every surface. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, their curiosity a tangible force. Evelyn's hands tightened on her phone, an instinctive urge to capture, to document, to control, yet the sense of control was slipping fast. Captain Mitchell adjusted the microphone. He cleared his throat and spoke over the intercom, his tone calm, professional, yet imbued with something heavier. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying through the cabin, "we will be stopping the aircraft immediately." A murmur swept through first class. People exchanged glances. Phones were raised, cameras poised, whispers rising like waves. Evelyn's stomach dropped, stopped. Why? Was there a mechanical issue, a security threat? She felt a rising sense of vulnerability she hated to admit. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened," Mitchell continued. "Your cooperation is appreciated." The plane shuddered slightly as the brakes held, engines humming in protest. Outside, a small gust of wind rattled the wingtip. Passengers craned their necks, trying to understand. In the aisle, Mitchell's co-pilot leaned toward him. "This is unprecedented," he said quietly. "The passengers, they're getting restless. Some are filming." Mitchell nodded. "They will understand soon enough. 9 minutes, no more. After that, we proceed as usual." He glanced toward the back, through the window that offered a narrow view down the cabin. There sat the old man, hands still folded over his cap, eyes unwavering. It was a calm that defied the tension in the air. Evelyn's curiosity escalated into suspicion. She couldn't see anything extraordinary. He looked like any elderly passenger. But something in the way the crew moved, the way the captain had personally intervened, told her this was no ordinary situation. "Why him?" she whispered to no one in particular. No answer came, only the growing awareness that history, silent, powerful, undeniable, was present in the back row of the plane. Minutes passed. 1, 2, 3. Each second stretched like taffy, bending the patience of passengers and the nerves of the crew alike. The cabin's atmosphere thickened, filled with tension, curiosity, and the unspoken recognition that something monumental was about to occur. Then, precisely 9 minutes after takeoff clearance, the plane's lights seemed to brighten, the cabin still silent in expectation. The intercom clicked again. Mitchell's voice, calm but edged with reverence, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to honor someone who, decades ago, changed the course of aviation history. I ask for your attention and your respect." The murmurs died instantly. Cameras were lowered. Even Evelyn found herself holding her breath, heart pounding, realizing the moment had nothing to do with convenience, schedules, or her sense of order. The old man's eyes lifted slightly. A faint, almost imperceptible acknowledgement passed between him and the captain, a silent, private understanding that this moment was inevitable, that recognition had arrived at last, and that it would leave no soul on this plane untouched. Evelyn leaned back in her seat, tension coiling in her chest. Whatever was coming, she could feel it. It wasn't a lecture, a story, or a history lesson. It was a reckoning. And the reckoning had only just begun. Suspense hook. The captain was walking down the aisle, and every eye in the plane followed him, not toward first class but toward the back, where the old man sat, waiting. The cabin was silent, the kind of silence that feels almost unnatural in a crowded airplane. Every passenger instinctively sensed that something important was happening, something bigger than a delayed flight or weather interference. Conversations had stopped mid-word. Phones were lowered. Even the flight attendants, who were trained to remain composed under pressure, moved more slowly, deliberately, as if not to disturb the tension in the air. Captain Ryan Mitchell pushed open the cockpit door and stepped into the cabin. His uniform, impeccable and sharply pressed, seemed to radiate authority. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He didn't explain. He simply stood for a heartbeat at the threshold, eyes scanning the cabin, absorbing the faces of 200 passengers suspended in uneasy curiosity. Evelyn Carter straightened immediately in her seat. Her irritation was replaced with a prickling sense of alarm. Why was the captain walking down the aisle? Why now? And why did the entire plane seem to be holding its breath as he took his first deliberate step forward? He moved slowly at first, each step precise and measured. The sound of polished shoes against the aisle carpet echoed faintly, yet it carried through the hushed cabin like a drumbeat. Passengers instinctively straightened in their seats. Conversation stopped entirely. Even the child in row 22 paused mid-whisper, clutching a stuffed bear, sensing that authority had entered the aisle in person. Evelyn's pulse quickened. The captain passed first class. She watched him move, an imposing figure of discipline and command heading past her, eyes locked straight ahead. Not a single glance, not a single acknowledgement of the anxious passengers. He walked with intent, and that intent told the room something critical was happening. Whispers began in the rear. Some passengers craned their necks to follow him, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The old man at the back remained perfectly still, hands folded over his cap. He watched the approaching figure with quiet understanding, like someone who had anticipated this moment for decades. There was no fear, no ego, only acknowledgement, a recognition that the moment had come that could not be postponed. Mitchell continued his measured walk, moving past rows, past murmurs, past the passengers' curious stares. Evelyn felt her chest tighten. What could warrant this kind of attention? Her mind raced through possibilities. A mechanical issue, a security threat. Was someone at the back of the plane famous? She tried to rationalize, but even her sharp mind struggled against the mounting tension. Passengers noticed the captain's deliberate focus. He didn't slow. He didn't falter. His gaze was locked, unwavering. A flight attendant tried to catch his eye to check if everything was okay, but he shook his head subtly, signaling her to let him continue. The old man's lips parted slightly, and for the first time since boarding, his eyes moved, not in fear but in quiet acceptance. He straightened slightly in his seat, shoulders stiffening just enough to hint at the pride and weight of unspoken history. He didn't rise. He didn't gesture. He simply waited. Evelyn, sitting in first class, felt a chill she couldn't explain. The air itself seemed heavier. She noticed other passengers staring toward the rear as the captain's presence moved past them. Some reached for their phones, hesitating before recording, sensing this wasn't an ordinary story to document. It was something deeper, almost sacred. When Mitchell reached the bulkhead separating economy from the rear rows, he paused. The entire aisle seemed to shrink around him. The quiet murmur of the cabin dissolved into anticipation. The passengers leaned forward. The flight attendants watched with restrained awe. Evelyn's fingers dug into the armrests. Her annoyance was replaced by an unfamiliar tension. She wanted to look away, but curiosity rooted her to the spot. And then he stopped. The captain stood directly in front of the old man, row 36, window seat. Hands folded neatly on the cap, calm as ever, yet the faintest glint of recognition flickered in his eyes. For a heartbeat they regarded one another, a silent exchange passing like an unspoken contract. Acknowledgement, respect, understanding. The cabin felt charged, almost electric. Passengers exchanged confused glances. Some whispered, some stared in awe. Evelyn couldn't breathe easily, her body tense, mind racing. What was happening? Why had the captain walked the aisle? Why had he halted the plane entirely for this one man? Mitchell raised his hand slowly, military precision, deliberate, almost ceremonial. He didn't shout. He didn't speak. He didn't gesticulate unnecessarily. The hand rose to his brow in a crisp salute. The old man's eyes widened slightly. For the first time, the past and present collided. He returned the salute, a gesture so precise and dignified it silenced every whisper in the cabin. Evelyn's jaw dropped. A ripple of astonishment traveled through the passengers. First-time flyers, seasoned travelers, children, business people, everyone felt the gravity of the moment. This was no ordinary recognition. This was history alive in the back of a commercial airliner. The old man's shoulders straightened subtly. He hadn't sought this. He hadn't asked for applause. He had never wanted recognition. Yet here it was, unavoidable, undeniable, commanded by the very man who had once been one of his students. Evelyn's gaze met his briefly. The arrogance that had propelled her through airports, airlines, and executive meetings evaporated. She felt small, embarrassed, and suddenly hyper-aware of how insignificant petty impatience could seem in the presence of true history. The captain lowered his hand but didn't turn away. Every passenger could feel the weight of his gaze. It was respect, reverence, and acknowledgement combined into a single, unspoken statement. Some people's lives have shaped more than just themselves. They have shaped everyone who followed. The plane remained silent. Engines hummed quietly. Passengers leaned forward, unsure whether to speak, move, or simply watch. Even the flight attendants, trained to manage emergencies and maintain composure, stood silently, witnessing a moment they might never forget. Evelyn swallowed hard. Her chest tightened. For the first time, she felt the power of humility and the insignificance of self-importance. That man, quiet, unassuming, aging, was commanding more respect than anyone else on the flight ever could. And she had been rude to him, demanding he move, questioning his place in the world. The old man tipped his head slightly toward the captain, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement. He didn't speak. Words weren't needed. The gesture alone conveyed decades of courage, sacrifice, and wisdom. Mitchell finally stepped back, giving the old man room to breathe. Yet his presence remained imposing, protective, and respectful. Passengers exhaled collectively, as though the tension had been held in their lungs and only now released. Phones were lowered, whispers hushed, and eyes turned to the aisle, the captain, and the back of the plane. Evelyn remained frozen, her mind replaying the boarding gate moments, the irritation, the impatience. Her irritation felt shallow now, almost absurd. She realized that life often delivered lessons in ways one least expected, lessons delivered in pauses, salutes, and quiet recognition. The captain turned back toward the cockpit, leaving a corridor of awe in his wake. The old man lowered his hand from the salute, clasped it over his cap again, and sat quietly, as if this monumental acknowledgement had already been absorbed and filed away in the history of a life well lived. Passengers leaned back, murmuring softly, exchanging glances, still digesting the gravity of what had just happened. Evelyn's eyes brimmed slightly with unacknowledged emotion, embarrassment, awe, and the sting of a lesson delivered too publicly for her ego to resist. And through it all, the engines continued to hum. The plane remained halted on the taxiway, holding every secret, every memory, every story in suspended anticipation. Suspense hook. The captain now faced the entire plane, microphone in hand. He cleared his throat. What he was about to say would leave no passenger indifferent, and Evelyn knew deep down that she had just witnessed the beginning of something unforgettable. The cabin held its collective breath. Every passenger sat upright, eyes wide, necks craned toward the aisle and the cockpit doorway. The hum of the engine seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a tension that pulsed through the air. Evelyn Carter's fingers clenched the armrests, knuckles white. She could feel the weight of anticipation pressing down on her chest, and a quiet, unfamiliar fear prickled her spine. This wasn't about a delayed flight or bad service. This was something entirely different. Captain Ryan Mitchell stepped back into the aisle, microphone in hand. His uniform was immaculate, his posture rigid with the authority of a man who understood the gravity of the moment. He paused in the center of the cabin, taking a slow, deliberate breath, letting the silence stretch across every row. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried clearly, firmly, but tinged with emotion, "I want to thank you for your patience today. What I'm about to share may seem unusual, but it is necessary." Evelyn's eyes widened. The cabin had gone still, all murmurs dying as passengers leaned forward. Even the flight attendants, trained to maintain calm, stood slightly straighter, sensing the gravity of the moment. He gestured toward the back of the plane. In row 36, window seat, sits a man who, without seeking recognition, has shaped the history of aviation in ways few of us can imagine. A ripple of surprise traveled through the cabin. Phones were lowered as passengers strained to look, trying to see the man he was speaking about. The old man sat quietly, hands folded over his leather cap, his expression calm yet proud. Mitchell's voice softened. Decades ago, during an emergency training flight, this man saved countless lives. Both engines failed in severe weather over the Midwest. It was a disaster in the making, a catastrophe most of us only read about in textbooks. But he remained calm. He taught, guided, and rescued without hesitation. He saved more than airplanes. He saved the lives of the men who would go on to become the pilots of today, myself included. The cabin grew silent. Passengers exchanged incredulous glances. Children, too young to understand fully, sensed the reverence. Business travelers and frequent flyers leaned forward, caught in the narrative. Even Evelyn's own breath caught. She had dismissed this man mere moments ago as an obstacle, someone in the way of her schedule. And now the truth sank in. He was a hero in the purest sense. Mitchell continued, his voice strong, steady, yet carrying the weight of decades. This man never sought praise. He never expected accolades. But today I am here to correct that. To honor him not just as a pilot, not just as a teacher, but as a hero whose influence reaches every pilot in this plane, every person whose life has touched the skis. Evelyn felt her face heat. Her earlier impatience, her snide judgment, felt shallow and absurd in comparison to the magnitude of this man's life. She shifted uncomfortably, unable to look away. Mitchell raised his right hand again, sharply, in a salute that cut through the cabin's tension. The old man's eyes glistened. For a moment he was transported back to the cockpit of his youth decades ago, when he had guided young pilots through storms, turbulence, and potential disaster. Slowly, deliberately, he returned the salute, perfect, precise, dignified. The gesture was not ceremonial, it was sacred, steeped in history, respect, and the shared understanding of a life dedicated to duty. A hush fell over the cabin. Even passengers who didn't understand aviation felt the weight of the moment. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It wasn't about social status. It was about honor, sacrifice, and the quiet courage that changes lives behind the scenes. Evelyn's chest tightened. She had expected drama, perhaps some minor recognition, but this was reverent. She swallowed hard, the reality pressing in. She had been rude. She had judged. And in the face of real heroism, she felt the sting of humility. The captain's voice returned, calm now, narrating history in measured tones. This man trained countless pilots who would go on to save lives in situations we'll never hear about. He faced emergencies that could have ended in tragedy, and he did it all without seeking fame, without expecting gratitude. He is the reason so many of us walk away from the cockpit alive today, myself included. Passengers leaned forward. The murmurs were gone. Phones were put away. Eyes stayed fixed on row 36. Children whispered to parents, passengers gasped softly, and even flight attendants appeared moved, some brushing away discreet tears. Mitchell stepped closer to the old man, pausing just short of his row. His hand lifted once more, a gesture of respect and gratitude. The old man returned the salute, shoulders straightening subtly, a quiet dignity radiating from him. He didn't speak. Words were unnecessary. The captain's words had carried them for him. Evelyn, unable to contain herself, whispered under her breath, almost to herself, I had no idea." The passengers watched her, some shaking their heads in shared astonishment. She lowered her gaze, cheeks flushed, silently chastising herself for the arrogance that had defined her for so long. Mitchell lowered his hand and addressed the cabin one final time. This is a reminder that true heroes often go unnoticed, that respect and recognition should be given, even when it's inconvenient, that patience, humility, and honor are timeless virtues. The old man finally leaned back, settling into his seat once more, hands over the cap. He had been acknowledged in a way that transcended applause or commentary. He had been honored in the only way that truly mattered, with the respect of someone whose life he had directly saved. The cabin erupted in quiet applause, not loud or boisterous but respectful, genuine, deep. Evelyn joined in, her hands shaking slightly, her eyes wet. Her previous judgments and impatience had evaporated in the presence of authentic courage. Passengers whispered among themselves, "Did you hear the story? He saved so many lives. The captain said he trained him." The atmosphere shifted entirely. What had been a routine flight, boring and delayed, had transformed into something almost sacred. Every passenger carried with them the weight of the story, the lesson of humility, and the reminder that true heroism often resides quietly, unseen, until the right moment demands acknowledgement. The engines hummed more confidently now, ready to resume the flight. The plane was no longer just a machine. It was a vessel of history, witness to a moment few would ever forget. Evelyn sat back, silent, processing the revelation. Her irritation was gone. Her sense of self-importance diminished. She realized she had been part of something extraordinary, even if only as a witness. She glanced at the old man. He smiled faintly, not at her, not at anyone, just a private, knowing smile that carried decades of wisdom. Captain Mitchell returned to the cockpit, leaving the aisle in stillness. The engines hummed steadily, the seatbelt sign still illuminated, but the tension had shifted. The passengers were no longer anxious. They were reverent, reflective, and deeply moved. The cabin was thick with quiet reverence. Even the hum of the engine seemed to soften, almost respectful. Passengers leaned back in their seats. Whispers hushed as they absorbed the weight of what had just occurred. Captain Ryan Mitchell remained in the cockpit doorway, now leaning slightly on the frame, observing the entire plane with a mixture of authority and empathy. Evelyn Carter felt her hands pressed into her lap, heat rising to her cheeks. Her previous arrogance, her impatience, her belief that schedules and efficiency were paramount, it all seemed trivial now, absurd. She had scowled at the old man mere minutes ago, judged him for his age, his quiet demeanor, his perceived inconvenience. And now she understood. She had been blind. Mitchell's voice returned, calm yet resolute, over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this flight is more than just a journey from Denver to Chicago today. It is also a lesson in humility, respect, and recognition. The man in row 36, whose life and dedication have shaped the lives of pilots across decades, deserves your acknowledgement." Passengers murmured softly. Cameras were lowered. Phones were out of reach for some, as though the weight of the moment made documentation feel inadequate. Children, too young to understand fully, sat quietly in their seats, sensing the solemnity. Evelyn's gaze shifted back to the old man. He remained seated calm, yet the faintest glint of pride crossed his eyes. He had never sought attention, had never desired recognition, and yet here it was, unavoidable, undeniable. Mitchell continued, his voice steady, deliberate. We often get caught in our schedules, our impatience, our small judgments. Today, I ask you to recognize what true heroism looks like, not in accolades, awards, or headlines, but in courage, patience, and unwavering dedication to others. Passengers exchanged glances. Some nodded, others whispered in agreement. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. She wanted to speak, to apologize, but words felt insufficient. How could she convey the shame, the awe, and the sudden clarity that surged within her? A young man in the aisle seat whispered to his mother, "Mom, did you hear? He saved lives, hundreds of them." "Quiet," she replied softly, but her eyes were wide with astonishment. The flight attendant, standing nearby, discreetly handed the old man a bottle of water. He accepted it with a nod, hands still folded over his cap. Even in this simple act, the gesture carried dignity, respect, and care. Evelyn noticed the subtle exchange. The flight attendant's eyes flicked toward the captain, seeking approval. Mitchell gave a barely perceptible nod, allowing the moment to unfold naturally, without fanfare. Evelyn's mind raced. The irritation she had carried through the gate, the haughty dismissal of the old man as a mere obstacle, it all seemed petty now. She had believed her world revolved around schedules and efficiency. And yet here she was, confronted by someone whose life had been about saving others, guiding the inexperienced, and carrying responsibilities she could scarcely comprehend. A middle-aged businessman whispered to his colleague, "I've flown a lot, but I've never seen anything like this." "I know," the colleague replied, eyes fixed on row 36. "It's humbling." Evelyn's gaze returned to the old man. His eyes, calm yet piercing, met hers briefly. There was no accusation in that glance, only quiet understanding. It was as if he could see her arrogance, her impatience, her self-centeredness, and choose not to condemn her for it. The captain's voice came again, this time with a tone that carried both command and compassion. "Let this be a reminder. Respect and honor are earned not through position, wealth, or status, but through actions, courage, and the quiet strength of character." Passengers sat, some nodding, some silently reflecting. Evelyn's fingers dug into the seat fabric as emotion rose, unbidden. She remembered her harsh words at the gate, the sharpness in her tone, the way she had demanded he move. And now she understood the depth of her misjudgment. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had done the same, judged too quickly, assumed too much, overlooked quiet greatness. The old man's presence had become a mirror, reflecting not only the courage of the past but the shortcomings of the present. Evelyn's breathing grew shallow. She wanted to speak, to apologize, but the words felt inadequate. How could a single sentence repair what her impatience had caused? And yet, she felt compelled to acknowledge it, even silently. She watched as the captain stepped back into the cockpit doorway, allowing the old man to settle fully into his seat. The engines hummed steadily now, and the seatbelt signs remained illuminated. Yet the atmosphere had shifted entirely. What had begun as frustration and impatience had transformed into reverence, awe, and reflection. Passengers whispered to one another, exchanging stories and remarks. "He trained pilots who are flying today. He saved lives and he didn't even want recognition. This changes how I think about people." Evelyn's eyes brimmed with tears. She realized that she had been small in spirit, judgmental, and impatient. And now, in the face of real heroism, she felt a profound sense of humility. The old man, sensing the shift in the cabin, leaned slightly forward and addressed the captain quietly. "I do not seek attention, Ryan. This is enough." Mitchell nodded, understanding the unspoken sentiment. "Sometimes history demands acknowledgement," he said softly. The cabin remained quiet, passengers reflecting on the weight of what had just occurred. Evelyn lowered her gaze, feeling the sting of recognition, of her own failings and the extraordinary life that had passed before her, unnoticed until now. Mitchell's voice finally returned to the intercom, firm and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will now resume our flight. Please remain seated until further notice. Let today's lesson remain with you. Respect, patience, and humility matter more than we often realize." A wave of silent acknowledgement spread through the cabin. Phones were lowered, conversations hushed, and passengers leaned back, absorbing the moment in their own ways. Evelyn's chest felt tight, her thoughts racing. She had witnessed something extraordinary, something that transcended schedules, delays, and petty impatience. She glanced at the old man once more. His eyes met hers again, calm, measured, forgiving. She swallowed hard, understanding that admiration alone wasn't enough. There had to be change, an internal reckoning, a shift in perspective. Passengers began fastening seatbelts in preparation for takeoff. Yet even in movement, the cabin felt different, more reflective, more patient, more aware of the small, quiet heroes among them. Evelyn exhaled slowly, feeling both chastened and inspired. She had thought this flight would be ordinary, a minor inconvenience in her busy life. Instead, it had become a lesson she would never forget. The old man adjusted his cap, folding his hands neatly over it again. He leaned back in his seat as if the moment had passed. But the impression remained, etched into the hearts of every passenger and especially Evelyn. Suspense hook. As the engines roared to life and the plane began its ascent, the captain turned back to the intercom, hinting that the story wasn't over. There was one more lesson, one final revelation, about the man who had silently shaped the skis, and the people aboard this flight had no idea what was coming next. The plane ascended smoothly into the late afternoon sky, engines humming with steady power. The turbulence from the storm outside the airport had been avoided, but inside, the cabin's atmosphere remained charged with the memory of what had just transpired. Passengers sat quietly, many still staring at row 36, where the old man remained seated, his hands folded over his leather cap. His eyes, calm yet piercing, scanned the cabin as if acknowledging every gaze, every reaction, every silent acknowledgement of the gravity of the moment. Evelyn Carter's chest tightened. Her mind replayed the boarding gate, her impatience, the scolding words she had hurled, and the sudden, overwhelming realization that she had judged someone who had shaped the very skis she traveled. She looked down at her hands, then back at the old man. Shame mixed with awe, humiliation with reverence. She had been small, petty, self-centered, and he calm, dignified, unshakable. From the cockpit, Captain Ryan Mitchell's voice came over the intercom again, measured, calm, but infused with the gravity that could not be ignored. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we continue our flight, there is one more moment I wish to share. This man," he gestured subtly, voice steady, "is not only a hero of the past, but also someone whose guidance has touched nearly every pilot you will encounter in the skis today. And I have asked him to step forward, not to boast, not to teach, but to show you the humility and courage that defines a true leader." A ripple of surprise swept through the cabin. Passengers leaned forward instinctively. Phones were cautiously raised, not out of disrespect, but in a desire to witness history quietly unfolding. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. She had seen countless people receive accolades, recognition, awards, but this was different. This was raw, intimate, and undeniable. The flight attendant returned to the old man, speaking softly. "Captain Mitchell requests your presence in the cockpit, sir, if you are willing." The old man's eyes flickered briefly toward the captain, then returned to the aisle. There was no hesitation, no self-promotion, only the quiet understanding that some moments demanded action, regardless of personal desire. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his seat, folded his hands over the cap one last time and walked toward the cockpit. Evelyn held her breath. She had never felt so aware of a single passenger in her life. She watched as the aisle seemed to contract around him, as if the plane itself was guiding him forward, and passengers instinctively moved aside, giving space and honor to the man who had changed countless lives. When he reached the cockpit, the captain stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The door closed behind them, leaving the cabin in an anticipatory silence. Passengers whispered softly to one another, exchanging awed glances. Evelyn's fingers clenched her lap. She felt small, insignificant, and profoundly moved. Minutes passed. Outside, the sky glowed with the setting sun, painting the clouds gold and crimson. Inside, every passenger waited, suspended in anticipation, sensing that the climax of this journey was about to arrive. Then, the cockpit door opened slightly, and the captain's voice returned over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone steady yet heavy with emotion, "you have just witnessed a rare moment. The acknowledgement of a man whose courage, guidance, and quiet heroism has touched countless lives. Today, he has reminded us that true leadership is not about recognition, fame, or status. It is about service, patience, and integrity. And for those of us fortunate enough to know him, it is a lesson we carry forever." A soft murmur spread through the cabin. Some passengers whispered, "Amazing." Others shook their heads in disbelief, while a few wiped discreet tears. Evelyn felt her own eyes welling. She had been taught many lessons in life, but none had landed so sharply, so unexpectedly as this one. Then, almost imperceptibly, the old man emerged from the cockpit. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't seek applause. He simply walked down the aisle slowly, stopping mid-cabin, meeting the gaze of passengers without hesitation. There was no need for words. His presence alone commanded respect, humility, and awe. Evelyn caught his eyes briefly. There was no condemnation, no judgment, only quiet acknowledgement. It was as if he understood her heart, her arrogance, her impatience, and had already forgiven her before she could apologize. She felt a lump in her throat, realizing that her petty frustrations had been inconsequential compared to the life he had led. The old man returned to his seat at row 36. He placed his cap gently on his lap and nodded slightly toward the captain, who gave a subtle, respectful acknowledgement. The plane's cabin remained silent for a moment longer, as though processing the weight of what had just occurred. Evelyn exhaled slowly, tears streaming down her face. She had been humbled in a way she had never expected. All her carefully cultivated airs of control, authority, and importance dissolved in the presence of someone whose life had truly mattered. She had witnessed heroism firsthand, not the kind measured by accolades or headlines, but the quiet, enduring courage that saves lives and shapes generations. Passengers began to shift, slowly, softly breaking the spell. Conversations resumed, but now there was a reverence, a softness in their tones. Some approached the old man discreetly, offering quiet nods or words of gratitude. Children looked up in awe. Even the flight attendants moved with more care, more awareness of the life and history that had just passed among them. Evelyn's attention never left him. She felt compelled to act, but words seemed inadequate. Instead, she simply inclined her head toward him, a silent apology, acknowledgement, and deep respect rolled into one. The old man's eyes flickered toward her briefly, and she felt a quiet warmth, a recognition that went beyond words. Captain Mitchell returned to the cockpit, closing the door behind him. The engines hummed confidently now, ready to carry the plane and its passengers to their destination. But the cabin had changed. What had been a routine flight, filled with impatience and small grievances, had transformed into a lesson in humility, respect, and the quiet power of heroism. Evelyn sat back, exhaling slowly. She reflected on her actions, her judgments, her impatience. She had been given an unexpected gift, the chance to witness greatness, to understand humility, and to recognize the fleeting nature of ego. She knew that her life and the way she would interact with others would never be the same. The old man adjusted his cap, folding his hands neatly over it again, and leaned back. He was content. Recognition had been given, not for vanity, not for show, but for truth, for history, and for the lives he had quietly saved. Passengers around the cabin exchanged glances, shared whispers, and small nods. The lesson had landed. Evelyn's chest still ached with emotion, but it was the ache of understanding, the ache of growth. She would never forget this flight, the man in row 36, or the captain who had recognized history in motion. Outside the window, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant streaks of gold and crimson. Inside, the plane moved steadily toward Chicago, carrying passengers forever changed by a single quiet hero, and the captain who had ensured that his deeds were finally recognized. And for Evelyn Carter, one truth had crystallized above all others. Sometimes the smallest gestures, an acknowledgement, a salute, a moment of patience, carry the weight of history. And sometimes the person you judge most harshly turns out to be the one who teaches you the greatest lesson of all. The plane's engines roared steadily as it ascended, but for every passenger, the story remained suspended in the air, a moment of honor, courage, and humility that would echo in their lives long after the landing wheels touched the runway. The end.